In a moment that reignited national grief, the story behind Matthew Perry's untimely death took a dramatic and disturbing turn on June 17th, when Dr. Philip Plasencia, the physician connected to Perry's ketamine therapy, formally pleaded guilty to illegally distributing controlled substances. This development came nearly 8 months after the beloved Friends actor was found unresponsive in his Los Angeles home, with ketamine later identified as a contributing factor in his death. At the time, many fans struggled to reconcile Perry's tragic end with the image of a man who had spoken so bravely and vulnerably about his lifelong battle with addiction. Now, Plasencia's admission has reopened emotional wounds and sparked outrage, shedding light on a darker truth hidden behind Perry's attempts at recovery. A trusted medical figure had allegedly bypassed legal protocols, placing the actor, and potentially others, at grave risk. The guilty plea confirms that the ketamine Perry received was not administered under appropriate clinical conditions, but rather as part of a pattern of illegal prescriptions distributed without proper oversight. For the public, the news was more than shocking. It was devastating. The idea that Perry, who had fought so hard to rebuild his life and use his platform to help others, may have been failed by the very system he relied on for healing, feels like a betrayal. His story was always one of transparency, of raw honesty, and now it has become a cautionary tale not just about addiction, but about the unchecked power some medical professionals wield over vulnerable patients. As details of the plea deal emerged, including a possible sentence of just 15 to 21 months, despite a maximum of 40 years, the internet exploded with calls for accountability, demanding that Perry's memory not be reduced to another tragic celebrity headline. For many, the courtroom admission didn't just bring closure, it reopened a deeper question: how many more lives are quietly being jeopardized under the guise of care? But beneath the legal proceedings and headlines, a far more complex and painful narrative began to unfold. One that challenged assumptions not only about Matthew Perry's final days, but about the fragile trust between patient and provider in the modern age of mental health treatment. As courtroom transcripts were released, it became clear that Dr. Philip Plasencia had not just made a professional error, he had deliberately and repeatedly skirted the regulations meant to protect lives, including those of high-profile individuals like Perry. According to the federal indictment, Plasencia had administered ketamine in ways that violated DEA guidelines, bypassed required monitoring, and failed to ensure the proper therapeutic setting. In Matthew Perry's case, that meant receiving a powerful dissociative drug with known risks outside of a controlled clinical environment, leaving him vulnerable not only to its physiological effects, but to the psychological volatility it can trigger. The contradiction was chilling. A man who had battled addiction with public courage and transparency, relying on licensed experts to help manage his trauma and depression, may have died because those experts broke the very rules meant to keep him safe. Critics of the plea deal erupted online, calling it a slap on the wrist for a practitioner whose choices may have indirectly cost a life. Advocacy groups demanded reform, while medical boards across the country found themselves under pressure to re-examine how ketamine and other psychedelic-adjacent therapies are regulated. Meanwhile, fellow celebrities and addiction survivors issued public statements not just mourning Perry's death, but expressing a new kind of fear, that even those with access to the best care can still fall through the cracks when medical systems prioritize convenience, money, or ego over responsibility. In a particularly emotional segment on a primetime news show, a former patient of Plasencia came forward anonymously, describing a pattern of casual prescribing, lax follow-ups, and a sense that boundaries didn't exist once you were famous. That interview, combined with the federal complaint, painted a picture of a doctor who operated under the illusion of discretion, but had created an environment ripe for disaster. For Matthew Perry, the cost was irreversible. The man who had once told interviewers, "If I die, I hope people say I helped," was now being mourned under the shadow of someone else's unethical choices. And that reality, more than the sentence, more than the guilty plea, was what sparked the most profound sorrow and outrage. Because this wasn't about a relapse, or a secret, or a failure of will. It was about trust broken, rules ignored, and a system that allowed it to happen. Then, as the public continued to process the emotional fallout of the guilty plea, the case surrounding Dr. Plasencia and Matthew Perry took on even broader implications, extending far beyond one man's tragic death and entering the larger conversation about ethical medical care in an era of celebrity influence and fast-tracked mental health treatments. Within days of the plea announcement, calls for a federal audit of outpatient ketamine clinics and off-label prescribing practices surged. Lawmakers, previously hesitant to wade into the gray area of psychedelic medicine, were now fielding media questions and public demands for accountability. Advocacy groups like the National Alliance on Mental Illness and Families Against Medical Malpractice issued coordinated statements, warning that Perry's story was not unique, but emblematic of a wider crisis. Behind the polished image of cutting-edge therapy, they argued, lay a dangerous industry gap, where desperate patients were vulnerable to overprescription and underregulation. News outlets released deep-dive investigations into the meteoric rise of ketamine therapy, revealing that in some high-end clinics, protocols were often bent to suit VIP clientele. It wasn't just a Matthew Perry problem, it was a systemic one. In a particularly damning segment aired on national television, a panel of addiction experts dissected the risks of administering ketamine without proper aftercare, likening it to lighting a fire without checking for gas leaks. At the center of it all was Perry, Not just the victim of a broken promise between doctor and patient, but now a posthumous symbol of a system in urgent need of reform. His own words, pulled from interviews in his memoir, began resurfacing with eerie resonance. In one clip, he warned, "Addiction is cunning, baffling, and powerful. And if you're not paying attention, it will sneak up on you." That quote became a rallying cry among his fans and peers, not as a testament to his weakness, but as proof that even someone deeply aware of their demons could still be betrayed by carelessness disguised as care. Vigils were held across several cities, not just to mourn, but to call for legal change, with signs reading, "Protect patients, not profits," and "Matthew deserved better." Inside recovery communities, the message hit hardest. If Matthew Perry, who had the resources, platform, and support, could be failed like this, what did that mean for everyone else struggling in silence? The climax of the story wasn't the courtroom. It was the wake-up call, a moment where millions recognized that the crisis was no longer theoretical. It had a name, a face, and a final chapter that should never have been written. Finally, as the dust settled from the legal proceedings and the headlines began to fade, what remained was a piercing reckoning, a haunting recognition that Matthew Perry's death was not just a personal tragedy, but a systemic indictment. The man who spent the final years of his life using his pain as a platform to help others had become, through no choice of his own, the catalyst for a national conversation about the ethics of care, the failures of accountability, and the invisible line between healing and harm. Dr. Philip Plasencia's guilty plea, while legally conclusive, left an emotional void that no sentencing recommendation could fill. For many, it felt like justice had arrived too late. Too late to protect Perry, too late to restore trust, and too late to stop the practices that may have enabled other quiet tragedies still unfolding. Yet in the void, something else emerged: action. Perry's closest friends and former castmates, along with advocacy groups, began launching initiatives in his name, calling for reform in how ketamine is prescribed, demanding more stringent oversight, and funding scholarships for addiction counselors and medical ethics researchers. His fans, far from moving on, transformed their grief into momentum, pushing for legislation known informally as Matthew's Law, aimed at tightening federal controls on outpatient ketamine therapy. Across social media and in sober communities, Perry's legacy evolved, not only as a gifted actor and fierce advocate for recovery, but as a cautionary figure whose death demanded more than tears. It demanded change. In the quiet aftermath, his words took on new weight. "When I die, I don't want friends to be the first thing that's mentioned. I want helping others to be the first." And now, for the first time, that wish was coming true. In rehab centers, therapists cited his story as both warning and motivation. In courtrooms, his name was spoken not in scandal, but in honor. And in homes around the world, those fighting their own battles felt just a little less alone, knowing that if even someone like Matthew Perry could be failed, then their pain wasn't weakness. It was proof of a system still learning how to care. As the final chapter of this story closed, it didn't fade to black. It lit a fuse. Because while Perry's life ended too soon, the impact of his struggle, his honesty, and yes, even his death, was far from over. It had become a legacy, one built not on perfection, but on truth. And that truth, raw, messy, uncomfortable, is now echoing through the halls of medicine, recovery, and justice, reminding us that healing isn't just a goal, it's a responsibility. One owed to every person who reaches for help, and one that must never again be taken lightly. Because in Matthew Perry's name, and in the silence that followed his final breath, we are being asked to do better, not just for the famous, but for everyone quietly fighting to stay alive in a system that too often looks the other way.